All right, so we had discussed neoliberal policy in our previous episode, as well as various, figures, actors, whatever, of the neoliberal project, and sort of what the neoliberal capitalist project affects in regards to like economic policies and such. This episode, however, we are going to expand that to discuss how neoliberal capitalism affects the environment, especially in regards to, global warming, climate change, and all that. How about we start by breaking down the difference between global warming and climate change?
I want to preface this with a disclaimer because there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of really just bullshit information out there. And we're in an environment politically nowadays where it's real common and acceptable for people to deny climate science. And even recently I heard a pundit say that they agree with both sides of the science. I just want to set the record straight here before we get into this. There aren't two sides to the science. There's one scientific explanation, and there's a pretty hefty consensus, I would say, in the scientific community about climate change. Beyond that, climate change being anthropocentric, in other words, being mostly generated by human activity. When we look at global warming and climate change, they're essentially similar, and people use the terms interchangeably. But global warming has to do with a rise in the temperature globally based on greenhouse gases, a rise in CO2 levels over time. Now, climate change is kind of like this buzzword that is like an overarching idea of climate. Climate being different than weather. Weather is, like isolated weather patterns. You have rain, you have snow in a particular area. When you turn on the news, you're listening to the weather, right? When we talk about climate is like patterns over time and predictions, but over a large area and a larger scope than weather. Like I said, it's sort of like a buzzword that's almost become synonymous with global warming.
They are essentially the same thing. However, climate change specifically is more related to changes in the weather, oceans, land surfaces, ice sheets, that sort of thing, only over time scales of decades or longer. It's not just like the day-to-day changes in weather, whereas global warming is the overall increase in temperature directly related to excess CO2 in the atmosphere, which traps heat here on Earth and thus raises the global temperature. So in discussing climate change and global warming, as we kind of just have laid out the basic skeleton of what they are, we hear about it a lot, but the blame is often put on individual consumers, who maybe don't consume ethically or, take shorter showers, eat less meat, that sort of thing. And on a global stage, the blame is often shifted to developing nations who in many respects are just trying to rapidly develop to, one, compete with Western economies like the US, but also at the behest of Western economies as well. With that said, what does our group think about ethical consumption? Is it effective? Is it not effective? Does it really get to the root cause of the crisis?
We just have to default to the old maxim. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism.
Okay.
Right?
Or late capitalism.
Yeah.
Why? Why is that?
It's because when it comes to individual products, whether it's consuming a little or it's consuming a lot, we're always going to be expected in capitalism to always ramp up production, keep consuming, keep spending, or else the system shuts down. So even if you're making a minimal impact on a long enough time scale, you're always going to be making some kind of impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're pretty much saying built into capitalism is this compulsion for constant growth. So it's even if you change your habits, next year Amazon or whoever or Whole Foods, they have to grow in size and scale, and by growing they can only do that through increasing consumption.
We've been reiterating since the first episode, the productive forces of capitalism, they're producing for free competition in a market sense. So just that concept alone makes any type of ethical consumption kind of null and void, because you're not producing for need. You're not producing for any direct sense of need. You're producing for a market so that you can try to compete with other people to sell your product for the most money for the least amount of cost.
Even on a historical scale, since the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, I think they said it's 90 corporations who are responsible for 2/3 of the world's global greenhouse gas emissions.
It's 100 corporations are responsible for 70%.
Yeah. So
It's a meme that's going around, so you might be familiar. Really good case studies, for example, you'll see those posts calling out vegans, for example, for eating more, obviously, like vegetative type of what am I saying? I'm making this complicated.
Vegetarian.
For people being vegetarian and vegan are always eating non-animal products, but at the same time, those products still require labor that is often like terribly abusive.
Very unethically sourced,
Unethically sourced, exactly.
Another thing that they don't realize is you could, if you just ate one billionaire, it would be drastically more effective than going vegan.
You would literally actually contribute to the decrease in global emissions. So you heard it here, new diet, eat only billionaires. Okay.
The Green New Diet.
So the Green New Diet, yes, I like that. Moving on from that, I think these discussion points, that we've just kind of even laid out here briefly, we've kind of come to this general consensus, or we're leading to a consensus that essentially any environmentalist ought to be an anti-capitalist, or anyone who claims this sort of environmentalist, badge. And in addition, I think we've also begun to highlight the fact that, environmental issues, just like economic issues that we've discussed on previous episodes, they don't happen in a vacuum. So environmental issues today often have cause and effects that are, connected to a greater web of various actions and reactions, right? So with that, how should leftists really be thinking about the environment today? How does it fit in with the bigger picture?
We'll express it later on, but also at this point, it's kind of succinct. We want to look at how these economic factors and limitations within the economic system that we use to produce goods and what that means for us. It goes beyond just using recyclable tote bags at the grocery store. It goes beyond these things because ultimately, in that example, you can bring a tote bag, but the person behind you, other than their own sense of responsibility, there's nothing telling them that they absolutely have to, bring reusable bags as well. Mm-hmm. There's no impetus on it. And politically, people are enabled to not get on board with these things anyway. So it's kind of like narratological, like ideological issue, but also an economic issue. And I think you can't really have one without the other. And we'll get into that later on. We actually have a real treat for you guys tonight. We're going to be having a real authoritative source on this kind of information come on, Kevin Martin, who is a friend of Jared's, and he is going to have a lot of information for us, and we're excited about that. But really what I think it means for leftists to digress a little bit is we have to look at all things considered. We can't just, make snap judgments or think that a lifestyle change is going to make it so these 100 corporations aren't outputting the majority of the emissions in the first place. Like, your personal decisions aren't going to have a big enough impact. We have to mobilize in a different way.
You're essentially saying, like, it's not that, change on, our end doesn't need to happen, but like it has to be systemic. It can't be a singular focus on one. That it has to be the entire system has to change in order for the right sort of things to start moving towards a truly carbon neutral future.
Right. Like we've said before, these things can be considered a tall order, but the whole point, what we're trying to do tonight is trying to convince people that it's not sufficient to just make individual behavioral changes. It's got to be a systemic.
And we need to sort of change the rhetoric too around it. I think a lot of people are still stuck in this like 1960s mood of like, we need to think about our grandchildren, or we need to think about our children. We're past that. You know what I mean? We're going to see the effects of climate change in our lifetime. They may not be affecting our area specifically, although we live in the Bay Area, so maybe we will.
Oh, we definitely will.
But it's going to affect somebody that we know. So we really need to start focusing on taking action now.
I would just add, even to this discussion, kind of going back to the sense that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like, there are a web of things contributing to climate change, largely related to capitalist modes of production. Those things have to change systemically, not only the economic system, but the political and social aspects that come with that at a large scale in order for, us to avert the most severe instances of climate change. And we aren't going to get that by allowing the status quo to continue, but just taking shorter showers or having your hemp recyclable
Right.
totes, like, because ultimately it's not reining in the greatest polluters globally.
I just want to put it plainly, like, one of my goals for this, whether it's this ongoing project that we have here or whether we can convince people just tonight, there will be people listening that maybe aren't convinced, but going forward, it is a big goal of mine to convince people the structures that are produced under a free market with competition and private property, like, they fundamentally can't produce a system-wide change.
Yes.
That enables us to restructure the way that we live, the way that we transport ourselves, the way that we produce food. These type of things are intrinsically tied to capitalism and the way that we produce commodities. So we can't look at this system that we've been using for the past 200 something years and not be critical about it.
I think that, there, with exactly what Matt just said, we need large scale systemic change, one that we believe is anti-capitalist in nature, fundamentally coming to terms with the fact that there is no such thing as ethical or green capitalism. And with that, we'll go ahead and get into our interview with Kevin, and we'll give you a little bit more about him now. Today, we will be speaking with Kevin Martin to break down these critical issues relating to capitalism and the present state of environmental and political affairs. Kevin Martin is a PhD candidate in geography at the University of South Florida, where he studies the urban environment broadly considered. Kevin's current research includes working on housing and neighborhood dynamics, including foreclosures and predatory lending, waste systems, environmental economics, critical data studies, and the sociology of scientific knowledge. In his past lives, Kevin once started a green business and also toiled for several years on behalf of the large multinational consulting firm Deloitte LLP. Next year, Kevin will be a visiting assistant professor at the Indiana University, Purdue University of Indianapolis, IUPUI, School of Public and Environmental Affairs. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Entry Level Left. My name's Jared.
I'm Matt.
And today we're joined by Kevin. So to get everything started, we'll go ahead and start with our first question. Kevin, what would you say every environmentalist needs to know about capitalism?
Yeah, so I would say that capitalism is really about much more than just the economy. And at the same time, environmentalists also need to be concerned about much more than just climate change. So what I mean from the perspective of capitalism is that very often when we talk about capitalism, we talk about processes exclusive to economic exploitation, right? The extraction of surplus labor, to use more Marxist terminology. But really, capitalism, broadly considered, is better conceived of as a sort of all-encompassing institutionalization of not necessarily all aspects of social life, but really very many aspects of social life. So when you take that broader view, you can think about how these processes sort of penetrate areas of life that we tend to think of that are outside of the economic realm. So all of the things that need to happen kind of behind the scenes to keep the quote unquote economy functioning that aren't necessarily compensated, for example, by a wage or something like that. So, raising the next generation, educating the next generation, care work, housework, all of these social processes that exist in the context of a capitalist organization of society, we don't necessarily think of as organized according to capitalist principles, but they really end up that way in a capitalist society where those influences are so pervasive in society. And then at the same time, the point about environmentalism and climate change, I know that most of what we're talking about today is climate change, but there's a lot of reasons, again, taking that broader view, that climate change is certainly a concern that should be at the forefront for many environmentalists and, just generally people who are concerned about the well-being of people and society and the planet. But as a result of processes that arise out of capitalism, there are other areas of the quote-unquote environment beyond climate change, beyond just atmospheric CO2 and methane and things like that, that are also strained. So other natural cycles, the nitrogen cycle and things like that and so on, that in addition to climate change pose their own unique problems, which are often exacerbated by climate change. So I would encourage a kind of broader view of both of these things. I guess I would also kind of offer a optimistic perspective, hopefully, or, something that's a little bit optimistic. But when we try to conceive of the role of these big, social level processes and institutions like capitalism, Frederick Jameson very famously said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. But there is within that one way of sort of thinking about or envisioning that at least some change is possible. So in this, I'm speaking more to people with a more scientific bent or an approach to sort of the big view of history and how species generally, humans usually included, tend to grow or in the terms that a biologist might use, consume more caloric energy and more resources and so on. But there are cycles within capitalism. There are booms and busts. And during those periods of time, at least from the perspective of something like climate change, we do see society temporarily operating under principles that are a little bit more sustainable. So, the usage of certain natural resources goes down temporarily. The strain on the environment in a lot of different ways goes down temporarily. Obviously, these aren't things that we try to emulate or talk about in terms of solutions to environmental problems and climate change, but they do offer the perspective that those things are at least possible. So, sort of casting some shade at deterministic arguments, which are, sort of very common in environmental literatures and conversations and certainly biology and whatnot. So that's my long answer to that question.
Sort of piggybacking off of that, which is a very broad answer that we're going to dig into tonight. We've talked previously on the show about how neoliberalism and capitalism sort of, to your point about the social cycles or the social institutions of capitalism, how they can sort of hyper-individualize solutions to more systemic problems of climate change or environmentalism itself. But we're interested in your take on this question, which is basically, can individual lifestyle changes under capitalism really allow us to work our way out of catastrophic climate change, or do we need to address the bigger picture in a more structural way?
The short answer that I would give is no. So individual lifestyle changes are probably not sufficient to avoid the worst case scenarios of climate change or even the sort of middle path scenarios of climate change. But to answer that question in a more detailed way, that is very much central to the period of time that we're currently living in. We don't really have a good name for it right now. Sometimes it travels under the name of neoliberalism or late capitalism or mature capitalism, something like expressing the idea that something is different. We can't quite put our finger on it yet, and there might be a big change coming soon. Right? Individualization of problems and whatnot, that's very central to the sort of ideology and philosophy that really governs the world according to those principles. And from the perspective of individual consumption, you may know that most of what my research right now focuses on is actually waste. And I'll just give you the numbers from that sphere to kind of put it in perspective. So when we think about the difference that individual consumption can make, at least the average American produces something like 4.5 pounds of, to put it simply, trash every day, right? So that's an average number. And within that number, of course, you have to think that there are some people who produce a lot more and there's some people who produce a lot less, right? And this is, of course, goes right in line with income usually. In Florida, here where I am, we tend to per capita produce a lot more, almost double and sometimes triple that number. But altogether, the entire United States produces something on the order of 250 million tons of municipal solid waste a year, to use the technical term. The similar figure for other categories of waste, right? So construction and demolition waste that results from big projects of buildings and infrastructure projects and these kinds of things, It's very tough to come up with a firm number for that. We don't really track it very well. We have estimates that sort of try to give a general number of what that figure might be, but it's roughly about double what the amount of municipal solid waste produced by individuals is. And that's just one category, right? There's other categories as well, medical waste and so on, all these other things. But then industrial waste on top of that, these things that result from larger industrial processes, is on another order of magnitude entirely. So just like things like construction, demolition waste, we don't have good estimates for exactly how much of this stuff is produced every year, but it's something on the order of a couple billion tons a year. So it's not even using the same sort of measuring stick of 250 million tons that are produced by people every year. So when we just attack the individual level, we're sort of leaving all the rest of that story out.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
So in one of our earlier episodes, we mentioned how capitalism operates on a logic of growth for growth's sake, in which the necessitation of production for profit more times than not leads to environmental calamity. Given this reality, can capitalism and environmentalism ever be compatible? Is there really such thing as green capitalism?
Yeah, so I might throw you a little bit of a curveball here, but so other people have looked into this question and obviously, of course, have argued about it a lot. It's a little bit of a leading question. One prominent example of trying to address this was, and a very good one in my opinion, was done by a guy named Richard Smith, who's a professor at one of the CUNYs in New York. And the book of his from 2016 called Green Capitalism, The God That Failed, right? And it's a collection of his articles sort of very comprehensively and combatively engaging that question. And he really sort of persuasively and devastatingly lays out the argument that green capitalism is really not a good solution, not going to get us as far as we need to be. And, he goes through all sorts of different examples of different industries that, have tried to go down this road, but have achieved these sort of minuscule returns. Even for one example, like the sort of for a time in the early 2000s, the quote unquote greenest company in America, or at least greenest manufacturing company in America, was this carpet and office supplies manufacturer called Intervest, which is based in Atlanta, kind of celebrated as the greenest company in the country. And even that company, where the CEO had this big personal epiphany and did as much as he could, this was a publicly traded company, to try to make his company as green as possible, the sort of successes are measured in terms of like 8% improvements, 10% improvements. And, a lot of this stuff is certainly laudable, but not, again, on the scale of the type of thing that we need to change. And so that's, one example of sort of a green capitalism approach that doesn't go nearly far enough. But the other sort of more shady side of green capitalism is, of course, this famous examples of, greenwashing the status quo. So not even really going down the road of trying to make improvements, but just trying to convince people that you're making improvements. And sort of one of my favorite, and favorite is a, strange word to use, but examples of that is the sort of BP rebranding that took place in the early 2000s, where British Petroleum rebranded as Beyond Petroleum, and they changed their logo and everything, to this green sunflower-looking thing, and they had a whole ad campaign about all the investments that they were going to make in renewable energy and technologies and whatnot. And when it was all said and done, a couple of years later, we find out that it turns out they spent a couple $1 million more on the advertising campaign and the rebranding initiative than they ever did on renewable energy and renewable technologies investments. And eventually they even shut down that part of the company. So that's like the textbook example of what some people call greenwashing, but just like a very inauthentic kind of green capitalism that's kind of whitewashing the status quo. So I'll just conclude then by saying that, trying to kind of more directly address this question and give you the curveball that I alluded to at the beginning, there is a worse version of this story, right? So like there are many different capitalisms and there are many different environmentalisms. So the question of whether capitalism and environmentalism can be compatible, I think, can probably be answered in the affirmative. These might not be versions of capitalism or versions of environmentalism that we want to see, but those are contests, right? These are terms that are socially defined, and what we get to call environmentalism is not up to me. It's up to what we all kind of agree that it is. And this might be getting a little too abstract and a little too sort of theoretical about the nature of capitalism and society, but when capitalism begins to fail or sort of confronts its cyclical crises, right, when it runs out of easily accessible opportunities for capitalization, exploitation, circulation of capital, right, it sort of frantically casts about in an effort to find new places to extract, right? And so it is possible for capitalism and capitalist tendencies to exist within certain parts of the economy, within certain parts of society and certain spaces, while not existing in others or existing in different ways in others. And so some of the more recent work that's being done in this area is sort of studying the capitalist processes of exploitation that still take place even in, for example, cycles of economic downturn, where some of the same machines, I'll give you an example from Detroit, some of the same machines that were used during the housing boom prior to 2007, the literal same backhoes and the same construction firms that were used to build these houses, eventually, as Detroit gets sort of parasitically hollowed out and is left behind by the more successful, more powerful cities that kind of take its place as manufacturing leaves and all these processes play out, the same machines are then used to demolish different areas of the city, and capitalism still functions, just functions as a machine of producing destruction and decline instead of producing something that looks like growth.
Right.
So there's a disturbing version of that story too. There are, authoritarian capitalisms. There are what the Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, he kind of coined this term, and I think it's apt, lemon socialism, right? Which is, we all live in conditions of capitalism, right? We're all subject to the dictates of the market. I have to go out and make enough money in order to feed my family, put a roof over my head, and so on. My literal body is subject to those concerns. But when broader, economy scale things happen, when banks fail, when the housing market crashes, they get bailed out, right? So it's really only capitalism for a few of us. It's socialism for the rich, for these large institutions that would prefer to live in socialism, right? Because it's more friendly, it's easier. They have a great time with socialism for themselves.
Interesting, because there's a parallel there in a previous episode that we had where we talk about creative destruction as coined by David Harvey in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Use that as a segue into the next question. So in addition to discussing such notions as green capitalism, we also hear discussions surrounding ethical consumption under capitalism. So once again, this often includes purchasing products that are deemed locally or ethically sourced, environmentally sustainable, or often organic. And I know you mentioned a context where sometimes capitalism can just try to sell a green product or market a product as green when it's anything but. So would you say that ethical consumption under capitalism, or we're talking about different types of capitalism, but would you say that ethical consumption under capitalism as a mode of production can essentially exist?
So first, I would say that I think ethical consumption is a spectrum. So it's possible to have more and less ethical consumption. The drive of capitalism doesn't encourage ethical consumption. As you mentioned, these things are often sort of perverted. The different definitions of these words, organic, sustainable, and so on, they get contested just like the other definitions that I was talking about before. But, on balance, yes, I would encourage people and say that it is a good thing to try to consume, behave, and live as ethically as possible. But, again, even that phrase, ethical consumption, gets perverted in the way that I was just mentioning, because we have this idea that, like, driving a Prius will suffice for your contribution to ending climate change or fighting climate change. And that's just, it's a category error. It doesn't actually satisfy the types of things that ethical consumption would require. But again, my own behavior is evidence of a lot of this stuff, but I would encourage people to do things like eating less meat, flying as infrequently as possible, encouraging companies and neighbors to do things like recycle. And I say this because the processes that sort of govern these things, the sustainable consumption, the organic consumption, the, ethical consumption. Again, they do tend to get perverted, but then at the same time, you can play some small role in at least making your preference for the availability of those things known, right? So like markets will respond in some small way to that type of demand, again, with all of the types of perversion and, exploitation that I mentioned before. But you don't just have to do those things in a market arena, right? So like politicians, city boards, and so on, they do take very seriously when constituents call or visit and make their voices heard and say that they want things like recycling programs. These are classic examples of non-market governed things. Try to make them governed by markets, but they're just very difficult to draw a surplus from, to make a profit off of. And I would encourage people to make it known that they're interested in having those types of services, those types of goods and things available, even in a non-market sense, right? So like provided by government, basically.
Right. So you're almost advocating more of like kind of an ethical consumption in the sense of awareness raising, and less in the sense that it's going to necessarily instigate some kind of like be all end all structural change.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like I said, I wouldn't imagine that these individual measures are going to create change on the scale that is required to deal with the problems that we face from an environmental perspective. But it's still worthwhile making those changes in your own life, if only because this is a personal opinion, but like because I've made many of those changes, I actually think that they are a better way of living your life, period. Like, again, I don't try to judge other people. I don't try to tell them what they should eat, because I think that's a very personal decision. But like my own decision not to eat meat has been extremely rewarding. And if I could go back in my life, I would have made it earlier. So, that's the reason that I advocate these types of things, is that I think that it, in a way, sort of harmonizes, especially for an environmentalist, it harmonizes your own behavior with your beliefs about the world. And I think there's an independent good there alongside the sort of maybe probably ineffective market signals that you can send with that behavior.
So we often joke with one another about how various words and terminologies have become gentrified under capitalism. Such examples include words and terminologies that have been so co-opted by the elite in society, so much so that all potential progressive tendency they once had has been completely gutted and rendered meaningless. Would you agree? And if so, could you explain why or why not, or maybe even give some other examples?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a funny notion. I haven't heard that idea of language becoming gentrified, but I do pretty much subscribe to the idea of, I don't know if anybody's used this phrase before, but like universal gentrification. It seems as if it's just all more encompassing and more pervasive in all of our lives, this type of transformation. So I think it's useful to do a little bit of a history lesson on these types of things, because like the ways that terms get manipulated in political discourse is not exactly as new of a phenomenon as gentrification. So like, you can take these things back decades and centuries really, to gain some perspective in terms of how like the words that we use and the contests that take place over language really do go a long way to determine, the arena of the political and what's possible and so on. So these types of discursive manipulations have always been around. But in recent years, especially the Republican Party has been very talented at sort of taking arguably more accurate descriptors for words and perverting them and changing their meaning. And so like, a very good example of this is something like the estate tax, which used to be a fairly non-controversial thing in the US, where when you are rich and you die, some portion of your estate is taxed before it's passed on to your heirs, right? There are few policies that you could imagine that would be more popular. Very, very few people end up paying the estate tax in any form whatsoever, because the first 5 million or 6 million per person of income, of wealth rather, is exempted from the estate tax. So you can pass on $12 million for a couple tax-free to your children. Taxing rich dead people is pretty pretty attractive policy to me, at least. But Frank Luntz is a Republican consultant who's worked on these types of issues for years now, and he is the guy responsible for inventing the term death tax. And the impact of this type of thing really can't be understated because, it is explicitly a political contest over meaning. And once it was rebranded explicitly and intentionally as the death tax rather than the estate tax, the popularity, which again, as I just mentioned, should be rather unassailable, taxing rich dead people, should be a universally popular policy, went way, way, way down. So now the death tax is, of course, considered, like all other taxation in this country, theft, and, it can't possibly continue, and we should get rid of it, even though it's only a few rich dead people who end up paying it. Another example coming from the same guy, believe it or not, is actually climate change. So the phrase itself was not in popular usage prior to his argument during the Bush administration way back in 2000, I think 5 or 3. I'm fairly certain it was an odd numbered year, but anyway, the much more popular, more common term prior to that was global warming. And, this guy is a sort of focus group savant, and he's written books about this stuff, and he conducts focus groups of people to see which types of terms will be the best ones to use for, their particular political ends. And during the Bush administration, he managed to successfully persuade the administration and then eventually broader society to start using this term of climate change, because he considered it, according to his research with his focus groups, he considered it to be more innocuous. It didn't sound as scary. It didn't sound as violent. People sort of could be, and this, of course, is central to the strategy. People could be convinced that, or were more open to being convinced that it was this sort of uncertain, distant, difficult to define thing. It could be good. It could be bad. That exists somewhere else out there. The climate is changing, but right here I just have weather, so that doesn't really affect me. And so it's been a very effective strategy. And I don't know if that necessarily qualifies as a word becoming gentrified, but those contests over meaning, they are serious. And maybe we'll get to this in a second, but I think the conversation about a Green New Deal is something that very much is going to be subjected to that dynamic. So I guess I'll stop there for now, but yeah.
Interesting for sure. So changing gears a bit, in their book, What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism, Fred Magdoff and John Bellamy Foster state the following: averting severe climate change would require building the equivalent of all of the following: 100 square meters of new solar cells, 50 square meters of new solar thermal reflectors, and 1 Olympic swimming pool's volume of genetically engineered algae for biofuels every second for the next 25 years. 1 300-foot diameter wind turbine every 5 minutes, 100 megawatt geothermal powered steam turbine every 8 hours, and 1 3 gigawatt nuclear power plant every week. Do you agree with this statement? And if so, what level of radical change is necessary to overcome these types of challenges in our lifetime? And can we reasonably see them being accomplished under the current system or capitalism?
So the statement from Magdoff and Foster, I would give like a conditional agreement with, and I'll explain what I mean. So I definitely think that their math, their numbers are probably all correct. I have every reason to believe that these guys are excellent scholars. I've, been informed by and admired the work of, especially Foster in the last couple of years, especially. But there is something to consider here, and that is that this perspective, right, that the way out of this problem requires this large-scale change according to a productive mindset. I'm not really using the words that I want to, but the idea that we need to build solar panels as far as the eye can see, and we need to take more of the economy into control, and we need to figure out how to geoengineer the atmosphere in order to fix this problem. That is a question that I think is very much up for debate. So in a vacuum, if this is the only choice, yeah, they're right that this type of stuff needs to happen. But in reality, there are better options available. And I'll give you a sense of what I mean more so is that we haven't talked too much about the specifics of climate change, right, of global warming and what it is likely to cause in terms of change for the world, and what it is already causing in terms of heat waves and bigger storms and wildfires and so on. Incidentally, as an aside, there was a very prominent article in New York Magazine about a year ago by a guy named David Wallace Wells called The Uninhabitable Earth, where we don't see these things very often, but he goes through carefully all of the worst case scenarios for climate change. We don't see climate change talked about much in the mainstream media, period, but we certainly really rarely ever see the worst case scenarios discussed. It's really almost a terrifying article to read, and I think it is still the most read article in the history of New York Magazine. But the interesting thing about this is that, like, yes, it is a big problem, but like, this is a little bit more of a personal opinion, but like, I think that the idea that we should engineer all these things, the idea that we need to build, again, solar panels as far as the eye can see, in a vacuum, I agree with that. But then at the same time, like, that is something that we would need to do in order to continue becoming more productive, in order to, maintain the capitalist organization of society, right?
Right.
On the other hand, like, I don't have research necessarily to back this up, but like, I think that it would be well received by the vast majority of humanity if we could get off that treadmill of production. If we could, just say, hey, look, we're going to, in a variety of ways, provide for everybody's basic needs. You're going to have access to health insurance, shelter, safety in terms of food security, and so on. And you don't need to have your physical well-being held hostage by, market productive forces. I think that the vast majority of humanity would say, sign me up immediately for that. We don't need to continue this productive economy that's actually not productive, but just, continues to enable a sort of ruling class of super wealthy billionaires to fly with private jets across the world every day. So, I think that there are other outside the box solutions here where the scale of the change that's needed, yes, is very radical, but I think it's more social change than it is engineering change. So hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, honestly, even to what you were saying about just kind of producing a standard quality of life, the majority of the world would agree with. It's hard to find, a UN document on anything related to global equity or human rights or anything like that that doesn't at least have that language in it. But of course, it always gets thrown to the back burner and canned by what is largely dominating on the world stage, which is global productive market forces, which take precedence, I think, over all of that in most cases. But in recent news cycles, freshman Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has generated a lot of attention for raising awareness of what she and others call, quote, a Green New Deal. Could you speak on this a bit in regards to what a Green New Deal might look like, and would it be effective in averting impending climate collapse?
So, as I mentioned a second ago, the Green New Deal is another example of one of these things that is going to be very much contested in terms of its meaning and in terms of, what it actually does. The Green New Deal, it doesn't exist yet in any really objective sense. There is the version that Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey, the senator from Massachusetts, unveiled last week. And a lot of the stuff in there is great, but we need to be very cautious in terms of, A, defending the good things that go into a Green New Deal and the types of reforms that are eventually adopted. And B, we need to be very cautious in terms of what I think is probably a little bit of a regrettable choice of words, and especially a choice of program to emulate, because the New Deal itself did a lot of really great things, but it had a lot of really serious shortfalls. The New Deal itself was a bargain between between elites, Roosevelt bargaining with other elites, of which he was, of course, one, in order to save capitalism, right? That was the trade-off, was that Roosevelt went to to put it simply, his friends, and he said, look, this is not working. These people just went through these two world wars. We've had all this economic growth and everybody said that they were going to benefit, but these people are experiencing the depression and they're looking around and they're saying that this is not going to work for them. So what are you going to do? They're going to be here with the pitchforks unless you give them some kind of new bargain or new deal. And so, explicitly, Roosevelt said that he was doing that in order to save capitalism, right? So the idea now really needs to be of something that's a little bit more advanced than that. We need to be thinking about the ways that we decommodify some sectors of the economy for the sake of sustainability. Like, for example, fossil fuel sectors should, at least in my opinion, be immediately nationalized, taken over and wound down, right? Because we know that most of the assets that they have on their books in terms of the oil under the ground can't be burned if we want to have a recognizable planet. The New Deal as well left a lot of people out, right? So specific portions of the New Deal were designed in order to benefit especially white, especially property owning people. So specific jobs like home care workers and things like that were disproportionately African American, you were not as able to get something like Social Security. And the legacy of that, of course, lasts with us to this day. Other stuff that kind of came after the New Deal, like urban renewal and all this and suburbanization, all of these programs, that could fall under that umbrella were designed to benefit certain sectors of society. And that's something that very much needs to be kept out of any type of New Deal going forward. For people today, as it goes forward, the New Deal itself, what ends up in it in terms of legislation and actual changes, the particulars really matter. So I've used this term before, and I think it's a very good one. These types of reforms are things that really will and should go beyond just environmental initiatives. These are things that should and need to address broader parts of the economy, again, decommodifying sectors of the economy. And the term that I favor for this type of thing has been called non-reformist reforms, right? So some people, especially on the more technocratic or neoliberal end of especially the Democratic Party, really want to, tinker around the edges and just do little tweaks here and there with policies and change them a little bit, but basically keep the same structure in place, keep the sort of wheels turning and the gears humming and so on. But there are certain reforms that go a long way towards freeing people up to a greater participation in civic life, aspects of life that should be kept out of commodified realms of society, political participation and, home life and so on. So things like nationalized health insurance, universal health care, fossil fuels, again, nationalizing those industries, breaking up telecoms, monopolies, breaking up big internet firms like Google and Facebook. All of these things will go a long way towards reorganizing the economy in a way that, the scale of ambition for this type of thing really needs to be considered. Otherwise, you just kind of stay on that treadmill of production and, end up where we are.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we would all agree with those conclusions that you're coming to. I think personally, especially something that is very important is when you talk about how even the meaning of certain words like, for example, Green New Deal or Medicare for all can become politically contested to, in some cases tend to not even mean what they initially set out to mean in the first place. So given recent reports suggesting that we have essentially 11 years to combat severe climate change and the impending 2020 election that could very well result in another 4 years of a Trump presidency, what are the direct political, economic, and environmental consequences of climate change that could be immediately felt in our lifetimes if climate change issues are not properly addressed?
So there's two parts to giving a coherent answer to this question. And the first is that I just have to note that while your question is good and the recent updates, especially the most recent report, I think, from the IPCC about the timeline for these types of things being 11 or 12 years is accurate, I really strongly do not agree with framing these issues in terms of deadlines. And I'll explain why, because you're absolutely correct that, the IPCC highlighted that once we get past that time horizon, then we've sort of locked in these really devastating outcomes. We can go more into exactly what the particulars of that are in a second. But that framing it as this binary event where there's a deadline, there's a date that once we pass it, it's a yes/no thing. That's not accurate, right? So like, yes, absolutely. If we go 11 years on the status quo, business as usual projection, we're going to end up in a really bad place. But that doesn't mean that once we pass that 11-year threshold, that means, okay, now we have climate change. It doesn't work like that, right?
Mhm.
It matters in terms of degree, right? So like, this is a spectrum. We definitely need to have extensive and really society changing responses to these questions, but it matters if we do a little bit, it matters if we do, something in the middle, and it matters if we do a lot, right? And it matters if we do it now, it matters if we do it in 10 years, and it matters if we do it in 20 years, because as bad as 1.5 degrees of warming, I'm speaking in Celsius for the moment, but as bad as that is, 2 degrees of warming is radically and almost incomprehensibly worse than that. And 2.5 degrees of warming or 3 degrees of warming, which we are on the projection to, is radically and incomprehensibly worse than that, right? So it really matters in terms of the degree to which we respond to these things. To get more towards your question of the direct political, economic, and environmental consequences, so they are extensive. I would again point to the article that I mentioned before if anybody is interested in reading more about the exact specifics of the worst case scenarios. That would be the one in the New York Magazine by David Wallace Wells about the uninhabitable Earth. But just to give you an idea, like, I started following these issues very closely probably about 12 to 15 years ago. And in that period of time, the work of the scientists who volunteer for organizations and groups like the IPCC and stuff have done just like such a yeoman's job of, and again, I'll stress, volunteering to donate thousands of hours of very, very valuable time to trying to convince society to do something about these issues. These organizations should absolutely be celebrated. Don't get what I'm about to say wrong, but like, I celebrate them in every way that the Nobel Prize that they received is deservedly representative of. But at the same time, scientists and these types of organizations are necessarily conservative, right? Because of the way that science works and because of the way the institutions that we exist within, and I'm talking about the academic institutions work, is that we necessarily try not to be alarmist. We are very cautious in terms of saying, this is a result of this, and this is likely to happen this amount of time, because scientists are very concerned about making truth claims in realms where it's very difficult to make truth claims. And the result of that, directly in terms of organizations, especially like the IPCC, but many others as well, is that almost without exception, the projections of these organizations have undershot the mark. So every time there's an update, every time there's some new word about how these things are going, what trend line we're on, it's almost always universally worse. So for your listeners who may or may not be aware, like who just have this vague idea that there's something bad called climate change or global warming going on, I don't mean to sound alarmist, but we are on the business as usual worst case scenario path still. We haven't gone off of that path. And even with the recession of 2007, 8, and arguably ongoing until just recently and maybe now, even with the reductions in emissions that have come in the U.S. and to some extent around the world as a result of that, we are still on that worst case scenario trend line, and the worst case scenario keeps getting revised upward. So the ramifications, the impacts of these things, I mean, again, I don't want to sound alarmist, but we are talking about severe and extensive impacts for the types of social organization that we are used to. And whether or not they can persist is an open question. So I'm here in Florida, at least for the time being, but Florida is sort of the center of this kind of business as usual. It's all going to be all right as long as we can build another condo building, it'll be fine, whatever. But, cities are genuinely threatened by this. And it's not like it's 150 years down the road. Cities are genuinely threatened by this now and in the near future. We're definitely talking within our lifetimes. So these are issues that we're all going to be dealing with. I mean, I'm sure I'm a little bit older than you guys, but yeah, it's hard to overstate the seriousness of the even moderate projections in this area. The moderate projections suggest that a city like Miami is genuinely threatened in terms of habitability in the next couple decades. That's the scale that we're talking about.
Well, I'm glad that you clarified for us and our listeners the kind of deadline trap and whatnot, because I think that's a way that people often get caught up in thinking about these sorts of things, is we have till point A, and then after that it's climate change or something. But I think all the points you made are very valid and useful for all of us here and probably listening as well. So moving on from that, do you believe there is any candidate or potential candidate for the 2020 presidential election that is capable of addressing climate change or climate change issues at a national level as it currently stands?
So full disclosure, I am, as we speak, currently wearing a Bernie shirt. Very much hoping that he will declare for president sooner than later, given that was, in my opinion, his biggest mistake last time, was waiting too long to declare for the race. So there's two answers to your question. As I'm catching myself with a theme here, but there's two answers to your question, right? So addressing the impending climate crisis at a national level, you can't do that, right? So the climate crisis is a global problem. The climate crisis is something that at one point, maybe U.S. policymakers, had we taken a really aggressive stance and taken the lead, there may have been a point at which U.S. influence on a global level was such that we might have been able to make some kind of dent in terms of the spectrum that I was talking about a second ago, to get us off the worst case scenario trend line that we are still on. It's really unlikely that that's still the case. There's a lot of reasons for this, but generally speaking, just everybody should be aware the U.S. is less powerful than it was a decade ago, less powerful than it was 2 decades ago. Generally speaking, there is a shift in economic activity and power and, of course, population from the Eurocentric perspective of the West to the East, right? Asian countries and so on. The U.S. definitely maintains a powerful status internationally, right? We have this position in global institutions like the UN and the World Bank and whatnot that does accord us a lot of soft power and influence in terms of what happens in the world. We, of course, also still maintain a really incredible network of military bases around the world. Investment in terms of dollars and resources and time in American military power is still unrivaled relative to the rest of the world. We spend several times what not quite the rest of the world spends, but certainly the next sort of 15 countries combined or 20 countries combined. That is roughly about how much the U.S. spends every year on quote unquote defense. So in that way, we do still have some influence on the national scale. But as the power, and especially the soft power of the U.S. diminishes for some of the reasons that I was just talking about, these processes of globalization and these bigger questions that we don't need to get, specifically into, as the soft power diminishes, as the obviously ridiculous and Fox News grandpa that currently occupies the White House undermines American soft power in the world, when the next U.S. president, who maybe isn't as crazy as the current one, makes a call or, signs back up to the Paris Accord or something like that, it just isn't going to matter as much. The soft power that the United States once could have wielded and, did wield for a lot of nefarious reasons in a lot of different places and, arguably some good reasons here and there, that's just diminished now. So it's just not as much of an option for the U.S. to address these things in a scale that needs to be addressed. So instead, it needs to be some form of cooperation. It needs to be some form of, the U.S. isn't even the largest emitter in the world anymore. Now that's the Chinese economy. And, the really big future contributors, which are the ones that we really need to have some concern about, economic restructuring and arguably some kind of climate reparations being paid to these people who are going to suffer more than people in industrialized nations are. In India, areas of sub-Saharan Africa that are scheduled for a large growth in population in the next couple of years. These are people who are owed, arguably, some form of climate debt. And who's going to pay it is an active question, because if you know anything about politics in the U.S. at the moment, there's very little chance that in the near future anything is going to be done anywhere close to the scale that needs to be done to confront this type of issue. I mean, the very idea of global cooperation on the scale that needs to be done is treated by one part of the political spectrum as a joke, a literal joke, and then by the other part of the political spectrum treated as cynical reason to get a couple votes and then not do anything, substantial. All that being said, I do favor engagement with political processes. So even though I don't think it's particularly likely, and I take somewhat of a pessimistic view of these things, vote, organize, knock on doors, do these things, not only because they're the right thing for you to do as a citizen in terms of your participation in our electoral processes and whatnot, but also because they will make you more sane and they will keep you participating in these conversations and these arguments. If you're just consuming it, if you're just arguing about it, you can lose it. And really, it's restorative to go around and actually meet people and actually spread this word and actually talk to people in the real world instead of just online and so on. It really can at times restore your faith in people to realize that, not everybody is red or blue or, Republican or Democrat or Trump or Pelosi or whatever. There really are, a collection of different people out there.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Vote, and preferably for Bernie.
Exactly. We agree. So, in closing, are there any final thoughts regarding capitalism and the environment or the state of global environmental affairs that you believe our audience should be tuned into or aware that we may not have discussed already? And more specifically, what should our listeners do if they want to get involved in issues such as what we've discussed in this episode, or what should they do to better help the current state climate affairs, if possible?
Yeah, I guess I jumped the gun on this a little bit a second ago, but my prescription is definitely to get involved. And I say that in a general sense just because, I don't want to tell you or your listeners exactly what to do, but do something. Become involved in some kind of group, preferably an activist group, preferably a group that goes out and tries to talk to people, to persuade people and change their minds. Do something that gets you involved with your neighbors. Join a community board. If you really want to go above and beyond, run for some kind of leadership post in that organization, whatever it is. More generally to our conversation, I would say, I would re-emphasize what I said at the beginning, and that is that climate change is definitely like the headline here. Climate change and global warming and the really terrifying changes, the really terrifying impacts that could come down the road in terms of making cities, whole areas of certain countries, whole areas that are very populated now, virtually uninhabitable. That's just the headline. There are plenty of other issues that travel under an environmentalist heading that are also very worthy of your concern at the same time. And to tie in with processes of capitalist exploitation is certainly a through line there. We do somehow solve, quote unquote, the problem of climate change. There are a number of other environmental problems that we will still be dealing with, a number of other social problems that we'll still be dealing with. And of course, I use these words in an overlapping sense because there really is no environment separate from society. There really is no economy separate from the environment or society. It's really just, it's all the same, broadly considered. The Anthropocene can be a valuable concept for thinking about what I mean there, so like the hypothetical idea that we now live in the age of man, with man being the most prominent environmental force in the world. The Anthropocene concept itself is contested in the same way discursively that some of these other things that we've talked about have been, but it does offer a perspective of the sort of wider lens that you need to be taking in terms of these environmental, social, economic problems that we confront as a society.
Right.
I would encourage everybody listening, and especially anybody who's feeling kind of, despondent about these things. Anytime you talk about climate change, it can be a very depressing and even scary conversation is just to get involved in something, especially for people who consider themselves activists. It's really important to engage even in the kind of discursive contests that we talked about a second ago. So, deciding how these things are defined really will go a long way towards figuring out how they get worked out. Is it the Anthropocene or is it the capitalist scene? Right? What should we really be attributing these things to? Is it man generally, or is it a certain set of social processes that have got us in this predicament? Is it the Green New Deal in the legacy of the New Deal and all of its problematic and unrepeatable ways? Or is it some sort of green themed transformation of the economy in a way that gives people the freedom to be liberated from the imperatives to, hold your body hostage for the sake of economic participation? That was the moral of the story. Is it universal healthcare or is it universal access to healthcare?
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
Right.
These are the contests about meaning that we need to be engaged in.
Right. And one final thing, Kevin, if our listeners wanted to read any of your work that you've worked on, where would they access that, or could you send it to us that we could link in our show notes?
Yes, I can, and yes, I can. So I do actually have a website.
Okay.
Awesome.
It's really more of a professional portfolio, but some of my research is and will be outlined there. And if anybody's more interested in the types of things that I'm studying, you can look up on what I'm up to now. Doesn't have a reader-friendly URL though, so you should probably just link to it.
All right, man. Well, thanks again so much for taking time out of your day to do this. I know you're busy as all heck right now, so.
Oh God, I'm dying. Glad to have talked. Enjoyed it.
All right, cool. Well, if that's that, then thank you everyone for joining us on this evening of the Entry Level Left, and we hope you'll join us next time for our next episode.